Today I want to talk about index funds versus actively managed funds. And also I want to say that I'm battling the flu-vid-18 right now, so sorry if I cough or my voice is kind of scratchy in this video. But in the last few videos I've talked about and referred to some investments, and most of which have been index funds. And index funds are essentially a fund that's trying to follow some given index. So, for example, you could create a fund that essentially tries to track the total US stock market. So, essentially, if you put money into that fund, you would expect the average return of it over the long term to be almost identical to the entire US stock market. And so, I've talked about this fund, Vanguard's Total Stock Market Index. That's what this means, Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. This ADM just means Admiral shares. I don't really know what this means. This is essentially just some share class, but the point is that this fund tries to track the US stock market. So if we look at the portfolio, which we've done previously, it's basically all US stocks. It has over 4,000 total equity holdings, so stocks, and it has 4,000 of them. And it essentially puts some percentage of the money that you contribute into each one of these stocks. So this list is 4,000 long, and there's a bunch of small companies that receive, fractions of percentages of your money that goes into it. But this fund is attempting to track the US stock market index. And essentially, the other type of fund you can invest into is an actively managed fund. So if you just Google the difference between them, it says index funds seek market average returns while active mutual funds try to outperform the market. So essentially some human being is attempting to do better than the market by choosing stocks. So they're going to try to pick stocks and companies that they think are going to do better, right? Unfortunately, the data and history have shown that index funds typically outperform. And the reason this occurs is because of fees. So active mutual funds typically have higher fees than index funds. So because someone is actively working to try to choose stocks, they typically charge you more. and this becomes really important, and I'm going to try to show that today. So essentially, you can kind of read and research this yourself, but from what I can tell, index funds are often a better bet. Actively managed funds over the long haul, so when we're investing for retirement over the course of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, typically underperform in index funds. So index funds typically outperform their actively managed counterparts. And history has shown us this. And so I'm going to show you some examples to give you some food to do research for yourself here. So right here we've got the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund, and this thing right here is very important: expense ratio. So this expense ratio is really small. So this is a really small expense ratio. This is what we would refer to as 4 basis points. So 0.04%. So if I put $1,000 into this fund, only $4 are going to the actual Vanguard for managing this fund for me. So this is a fund that I invest in. This is an index fund. Right here is we have another company called Fidelity, and here's an actively managed fund. This is just called the Contra Fund. I have no idea what this means, but I pulled this up because this is a fund that I can invest in my 401k, so that my employer offers this fund to me. But look at this, the adjusted expense ratio is 0.81%. So this is much higher than this 0.4%, right? And I'm going to try to show how important this actually is. So we looked at this Vanguard's total stock market index. And if we look at the portfolio, it's basically US stocks. So this is like essentially the market weight of each stock. And so this is something I invest in. If we look at Fidelity, it's the actively managed fund, so it has a much higher expense ratio. it's a pretty similar fund, not identical by any means, but it's mostly U.S. stocks and you know, similar portfolio. Here's another investment that I pulled up. This is another investment that I am offered in my 401k plan to invest in. This is another actively managed fund, so you can tell that by the expense ratio being much higher. And you might say 0.8% compared to this Vanguard one, which is 0.04%. That doesn't seem like that much. And it doesn't, but I'm going to show you that over the long period of time, this is actually very important to our wealth and how these fees can totally take hundreds of thousands of dollars from us. So that being said, what I've done is I've taken this compound growth calculator and I've just taken this first sheet and copy and pasted this 3 times. I've included expense ratios so that we can kind of look at this. So essentially, let's make this a little bigger. Essentially, I've also used this software called Portfolio Visualizer to do what's called a back test. So we're going to look back in time at these 3 different funds and see how they've done. So right here I have VTSAX, which is this Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund right here. And then I've got FCNTX, which is this Fidelity Contra Fund, so I could invest in this, FCNTX. And then the third one I have is just that OGLYX fund, which is that Invesco Global Y, whatever this means. So this invests in both US and international companies, OGLYX. And so what I've done is I've actually just said, okay, let's assume that I put all my money, 100% of my money into each 3 of these funds, so we can kind of just compare how they did. And that's just assuming I put 10 grand into them. So if I click this Analyze Portfolio button, this software allows me to compare these returns essentially. And so I'm gonna put these funds into perspective here. So this data goes back to 2001. So this is essentially 20 years of data. Sorry, I'm actually going to change this to 2022. So this is 21 years of data right here, and we can look and we can compare how our money would have grown if we had invested in these 3 different funds. So this is not necessarily how you invest, right? You'd probably have you know, some money in bonds and maybe a few different funds. You probably wouldn't just put all your money into one of these funds, but for comparison purposes, it's easier to just compare if we put all of our money into each one of these funds, what would have happened. So if we had put 10 grand into this fund in 2001, we can compare how they would have done. And so essentially, if you look right here, you know, these are the 3 different funds, and we can see that the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index, a fund that I invest in, is in the blue here. And so it's falling between, in terms of total returns, it's somewhere between these 2 funds. So over those 20 years, that 10 grand initial investment for the Total Stock Market Index, the blue fund, would have grown to 50 grand. But look at this, the Fidelity Contra Fund did quite well. It grew. It's the red there, this top plot here, and it currently is sitting at 67 grand. So that's a big difference, you know, 17 grand. But then on the other hand, this Invesco Global Fund is only sitting at 40,000. So it's underperforming. And so essentially, if you had invested in any of these funds, you would be making money. So you're not in a bad place. And so part of this series is to show you that there's millions of different investment options you can choose. And people are going to get very obsessive about what to choose. But at the end of the day, what becomes more important is the time that you invest. So if you start when you're younger and you stick to it, essentially, if you continue to invest, if you continue to add money to these accounts, either one of these funds, if you had put all of your money into either one of these funds, you're looking pretty good, right? Your 10 grand is turning into a lot more money. So essentially, if you had just left the 10 grand as cash in your bank account, that's basically the worst case scenario that you could have done. And so while you're investing for retirement, you'll hear a lot of talk. People love to compare essentially their return percentages, right? Their interest rate. Everyone wants to up this because it's obviously important, but I'm going to argue that it's more important to invest over the long period of time and essentially to stick with a plan that has low fees and just continue to do it for your whole life. And if you do that, you're probably going to be in a good place. So with that being said, we can actually look at these three funds. So look, right here, this stands for compound annual growth rate. So essentially this is your interest rate, your growth rate per year. And so I've actually modeled this on my compound growth rate calculator. So I've taken these percentages for each of these funds, 7.64, 9.13, and 6.58. And I've plugged them in right here. So this is the Vanguard index fund. I've also included the expense ratio here. And here's the Fidelity Contra Fund with the higher outperformance over the last 21 years. And here's the Invesco Global Fund. And so I've included their, right, so 6.58 was the Invesco Global, 9.13 Fidelity, and the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index. And so I've also included their expense ratios. So Vanguard's expense ratio is right here, 0.04. So that's included right here. Fidelity's is 0.81%, right here. So that's included right here. And then this Invesco Y is 0.8%, right here, expense ratio. And so I just wanted to do this little exercise to show the importance of expense ratios, essentially. So look, so if we got this 7.64% with this Vanguard Total Stock Market Index, and let's assume we got that over the whole course of our investment for retirement. So we invested for 38 years. We got 7.64. So look at that. If we put $500 a month with an initial investment of 10 grand for 38 years at that rate, we're left with $1 million, 1.5 actually. And so that's all nice, but look, this expense ratio matters. So what I'm going to do is take this cell and subtract this expense ratio, right? So we're not getting this money because it's going to the fund manager. It's the fee, essentially, the expense ratio. So this is the cost of investing in this fund. And so this index fund is very cheap, so super small expense ratio. So if I do that, watch how this $1.5 million will change. So with a small expense ratio, look at that. We're still at 1.5 million. So I'm not actually sure how much that changed because this is a small expense ratio. But okay, so now let's go over here and assume that this Fidelity Contra Fund with the same parameters, $500 a month, 10 grand initial investment at that 9.13, so what it got over the last 20 years. But so this is obviously great, right? The difference between 7.6 and 9.3 is going to have a large effect on your future value over a long period of time, right? If we invest for 38 years. So look, this portfolio is at 2.3 million. But what I'm going to do here is we're going to subtract this expense ratio, and this is not even 1%, but essentially anything, something close to 1% is going to have a huge effect on this because this is only 9%. So we're going to subtract this expense ratio and look what happens to, watch this future value calculator just based off the fee of this fund. So 2.3 million, boom. And because of this 0.81% expense ratio, we've now lost close to what, $500,000, somewhere in that area. And so that is incredibly important, right? So this expense ratio is a very important piece of information. This is why it's like one of the first things you see when you pull up a fund. It essentially tells you, this is the first piece of data that most people are looking at. Because having an expense ratio of close to 1% has a huge effect on your money over the long period of time. So this is the reason why fees are so important. And so let's look at this last example here. So this is the Invesco Global Fund, another actively managed fund, a very similar expense ratio, so 0.8%, and its return over the last 20 years was 6.58%. And so what I'm going to do is, so with the same parameters, 6.58%, we're left at a little over a million, 1.1 million. And so I'm going to subtract the expense ratio from this, and we're just going to see how much money these fees are going to cost us over the long period of time. Look at that, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So $300,000 essentially. And so this is, I wanted to make this video to try to show you why this is so important, why fees are incredibly important. And so let's go back to this page, index funds versus actively managed funds. Essentially, the reason why index funds are often a better investment over the long period of time is because these actively managed funds have these higher fees. And it becomes very hard to outperform the stock market over like 30 or 40 years, because it essentially means you have to pick the right stocks for 30 or 40 or 50 years, and then it's incredibly hard to do. We know that it's very unlikely, essentially, and history has shown that index funds are often better. If you can read about this stuff, so look into this stuff for yourself, but basically, like, fees are kind of the reason why, because in order to perform this much better than the index, you have to be doing a lot of things correct. And the stock market is very variable, so it's hard to know, right? It's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future. And so even just beating a low cost index fund, you know, that has a very low expense ratio by 1% would be very challenging to do, and it will happen. Usually not over the long period of time, but some funds have been able to do it. But the point is that if your fees are close to 1% too, then it's essentially impossible. You're not making any more money after the fees. So this is why I suggest investing in low-cost index funds, and many people do. So you want to keep your fees down. And let me show you a few more examples of this. So right here, I have just some generic inputs. So let's say we get 7% return over the long period of time on our investments, which is probably a fairly realistic kind of interest rate over the last, 30, 40 years or whatever. In fact, this is probably pretty realistic over the whole US stock market. Somewhere in there, if you invest in mostly stocks and have some small allocation to bonds, and then this could be a good assumption, 7%. You do it for 38 years. Let's say you put $500 a month into an IRA, so a Roth IRA maybe, and then also you might take $500 and put it into a 401k. So let's say you invest $1,000 a month for these 38 working years. And look at this, at 7%, you now have a portfolio of $2.5 million. So this is essentially your retirement fund, and you can start to draw from this, 50 grand the first year, and then a little more because of inflation the next year. And you start to take money out of these stocks and bonds while leaving the rest of it in them, so that it continues to grow through retirement, but you're taking from it, right? You're selling these stocks and bonds for this income so that you can afford to live, right? So here we are at 7%, we have $2.4 million. And I wanted to talk about one other thing. So a management fee. So let's assume you have someone managing your money for you. For example, you might have some brokerage that's saying, okay, we'll do all this stuff for you. We'll plan all these, suggest your investments and tell you where to put it into your accounts. And so they're going to help you manage all this retirement money stuff. But let's say they say, in order for us to do this, we're going to charge you 1% on your investments. And you might think, oh, 1%, that seems very small, But how that works is they charge you 1% every year, right? So that's no different than subtracting 1% from your interest rate. And so let's say when you started investing for retirement, you started using some manager to help you do this, and you're paying them a 1% fee. So look at what happens when I take 7% and subtract this management fee. So we're at $2.4 million, and look at what happens here if I take 1% off of that. That's more than $500,000. And these are pretty realistic parameters for most people that are working their whole lives. They likely could invest up to $1,000 over the long period of time, right? And so getting 7% is pretty realistic too. So if you take 7% and turn it into 6 because of this management fee, over the long period of time, that costs you so much money, more than $500,000 in this case. And so this is why you have to be very wary of management fees and expense ratios. People have realized that, if we can charge close to 1%, we're gonna make a ton of money. And essentially, you don't need to use these managers. You can use index funds that are super low cost and actually tend to do better. So it really doesn't make much sense to have high fees anymore while you're investing. So I wanted to show these examples to give you kind of some thought about how important these fees are for you. One other cool little example that I wanted to finish the video with is another one of these backtest calculators. So I chose the Vanguard's Total Stock Market Index, right? This is something I invest in. This is basically the US stock market returns. And then I also chose this actively managed fund. So this is a fund called ARK Innovation. This has had a lot of hype over the last few years because it's done super well. So this expense ratio is pretty high too, right? This is a high expense ratio because this is an actively managed fund. But look at this. If we look at Vanguard's Total Stock Market Index versus this ARK fund, this ARK Innovation Fund, which is just some actively managed fund, over the last few years, this fund has done really well. So I just have 100% of the portfolio in this VTSAX and 100% in this ARK fund. And look at this. Here's the blue is the Total Stock Market Index Fund. So this is what I've been investing in. And look at this, the red fund, ARK Innovation, has totally done incredibly well. So this is an actively managed fund that has been doing really good. And so essentially, you might be able to, people might talk about this or say, oh, look, this fund is doing really well. I'm going to buy this fund because it's doing so well. And essentially what history has shown is that when a fund, an actively managed fund, tends to do really well and essentially outperform the market by a lot, people like to buy it because they think that that's going to continue. But what history has shown is that it typically doesn't continue. It might last for 10, 15 years, but in terms of investing for retirement, so like 30 or 40 years or longer, we know that essentially the US stock market is super hard to beat over that long period of time. So history has shown that. So a bunch of people start buying this fund because people see these gains and they get essentially emotional that they're missing out on this money, right? It's hard to have your coworker say like, oh, I'm invested in what XYZ, in this case, ARK Innovation, and look, I'm making this huge profit, and you're sitting down here playing this low cost slow game, just trending upward over time, whereas your friends might be, or your coworkers, whoever, someone's always going to be telling you this, your uncle or whatever, I'm making a killing off this stock or this crypto or whatever. So what tends to happen is these funds might do well for a period of time, but essentially over the long period never win. So I'm sure a bunch of people started buying into this fund because it was outperforming the market so steeply. But look, I'm currently showing data from 2015 to 2021, so last year. And look, if I change this back to 2022, look at what will happen now. All of a sudden, oh, this fund has this huge steep decline, and look, now the Vanguard stock market is actually winning again. So this blue fund that's just slow and steady wins the race. just, all your friends are buying this fund because they're so excited because it's getting so high. But look, it tanks hard when the market crashes. And here we are now, and the stock market index fund is doing a little better. And so essentially actively managed funds can do well, and they will outperform. But essentially, over the long period of time, the index funds with very low fees tend to do better. And so I wanted to try to give you some examples and kind of try to drive into your brain that fees do matter, and management fees and expense ratios start to have large impacts over the course of our 30 years of investing. So I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some data and some examples on fees and expense ratios. So just be aware of that and understand how important small changes in your interest rate can have over long periods of time.